Recording now. Okay, welcome everybody. I have on the other line here Clips4Lyfe, a longtime Maverick player, and we're going to be talking about green-white. Should be some fun conversation here. We've got some cool slides. Have been working on a little bit of an outline. At the end of this, we'll go over Clips' latest list on MTGO. I don't think we'll have time to stream it tonight, but that's okay. We'll do that some other time. Clips, why don't you introduce yourself? Say hi.
Yeah. Hey, I'm Clips4Lyfe. Thanks for having me on, Gary. Been a fun prep, really fun prepping for this. I am a Maverick aficionado. I love Magic. It's my passion project when I'm usually thinking about twinkering, even though I would call myself more of a Jeskai Stoneblade player primarily, or Control. But Maverick's probably my baby. The most time spent in theory, deck building, theory crafting, and understanding what Maverick is doing in 2024, what makes Maverick actually playable, and finding the strengths of our deck.
All right, so let's go through these here. Okay, cool.
Just kidding.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's get to it. All right. We want to start with the tone of this. Obviously, we love the environment of people talking about Maverick, and I just wanted to start with this kind of tone setting, which is that when you're doing this, you are playing on hard mode, and you're playing Maverick because you want to. This is not the easiest or fastest thing you could possibly play, but it's style points with old cards. You are favored versus some things, particularly any big artifact pile or people trying to play 4-mana non-creature spells. So there are some things you're really favored for, or could be favored. And of course, it's very flexible. We have different flashes, and we're going to talk a little bit about that here. But I just love this picture of this classic air-cooled Porsche. I don't have one of these. Maybe someday I will. Obviously, you can buy a faster car. You could buy a better car. But there's sort of the art of driving this thing and making it work and making it your own. So I just wanted to mention that here, just so that nobody thinks that if you do this perfectly, you will 5-0 everything or win the next. But yeah, any thoughts on this, Chris?
No, for sure. I completely agree with you. Maverick is, to make super clear with everyone, is not a tier 1 deck or strategy, but we still think it could be competitive when understood correctly and played tight, whatnot. I think one thing that comes to mind was there was, like, I think Dukes might have pointed out, or some people on Twitter, of wanting to have free wins in your deck in 2024. And while there are, like, we'll probably get into it, there are some, quote, free wins with our deck. We play this deck because we don't want free wins with our deck. We want to play Magic and be interactive and play fair, and that's okay. We're not making the deck worse by doing that. You just have to earn your wins, and you have to play really tight and play well to do that. There's no free wins.
That's right. That's right. No free wins, and I don't know. You're doing it because you smile when somebody casts a 2-mana Ponder and then doesn't find the land. You're like, okay, now I have one in my heart. Okay. So, a lot to get to here, but I just want to make sure we covered that here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Maverick game plan here? What is tempo?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Gary. I think when I hear people talk about Maverick, it's thought of a toolbox deck or a mid-range deck, neither reliquary strategy. I think Maverick has those things in it, but I think that is a misunderstanding of what makes Maverick, at least for these green white or even absent builds. I think Punishing, Saga, Maverick, Stack Daddy's deck is a totally separate entity in itself. But tempo is really, you said sticking a threat and attack and defending that thing. I think tempo is really leveraging mana and creating mana disparities between you and your opponent. So if you think about Delver, like the ideal tempo strategy, Delver wants to use Wasteland and Daze with 1 mana threats to be able to tempo out the opponent. Sometimes that's protecting the queen. Sometimes that's just like offsetting them just long enough to cross the finish line with Delver. I would say Maverick would fall, green-white Maverick at least falls into that second category of really trying to disrupt your opponent enough with Wasteland and Hate Bears so that you can cross that finish line and play this aggressive mid-range strategy, or what I like to call tempo.
Yep, that's absolutely right. It was a great article posted by somebody in the lands community that really explained what tempo is. Almost think of it like an emblem that passes back and forth, and you want to be ahead. A lot more could be said about what is tempo, but green-white specifically is playing a tempo plan, is really the whole thing. Maybe the other splashes don't, but green-white does, or at least the way we're going to talk about it today.
It
here.
reminds me too, Gary. There's a really good Julian video. This is before the initiative, or actually right when I think during White Plume. But he plays Maverick, and he talks about how Maverick is a deck that takes the initiative, but not like mechanic, but it's like literally taking the initiative. And so all of your threats, you want to take the initiative where like they must be answered, and it puts your opponent in a position where they have to react to you, or else they're just like scrambling. And I think that's like another way to say tempo.
That's right. And then it was brought up here when we were putting this together. You want to do something at a power level here, and we're going to really leverage this obnoxious
Mm-hmm.
land that blows up other people's lands, and we're going to try and do it better than anybody. All right, so a little more on tempo here. Um, how does this work for green white specifically?
I think tempo, and it goes back to what is Maverick, and if we redefine Maverick not as a Zenith deck, but as a wasteland strategy, because wasteland is a pillar we can build upon. Green Sun Zenith is not. That's a modern card now.
Yeah,
Like there's so many Zenith decks. There's the Yorion Yes deck. There's the Green White Depths. There's Bance Nadu nowadays. There's a lot of better Zenith piles with bullets or like a proactive oops I win tutor target. So we're really focusing on Wasteland since 60 card Death and Taxes is now done. But Tempo is really THALIA and blow up a land is our quote combo. If someone keeps a land light hand and you THALIA Wasteland them, they just die on the spot. Or THALIA is a Hymn to Torok, which we love to see when we're playing 3 to 4 copies of her. By using Tempo and Wasteland, we can start to create mana parity advantages against our opponent. Everything we do in our deck at face value is a bad card as far as power level goes. Noble Hierarch is a bad card in Legacy compared to Moxes that get played, right? Or Ancient Tomb.
mm-hmm.
But what Noble Hierarch can do is create mana parity where we get up a mana, and then THALIA puts us up another mana. Wasteland can create parity as well, going from 1 versus 2 mana to 0 versus 1 mana, and we can capitalize on that with the other pieces. And then Knight of the Reliquary really helps support that by getting more wastelands. And again, it puts a ton of pressure on the opponent to answer this or get wasted again.
Yeah, Knight of the Reliquary here, and we're actually not going to talk about it like that much today because Knight of the Reliquary is a staple of all the different versions. But of course, it's doing all this stuff. It's finding a couple of spells it can cast, and it blows up your opponent's lands, and it's a finisher, and sometimes it helps ramp out and do other things.
Mm-hmm.
Find a cradle to let you go down to
Mm-hmm.
one land while you keep blowing up stuff. Yeah, and of course, Exalted is keeping the pressure on as well. Again, true for the other
Mm-hmm.
version, and really. I think our main idea here is we want a critical mass of stuff that we can cast on turn 2, ideally around days, that are on basic colors, and that's basically how green white works on this plan here. We really want
Mm-hmm.
to put the opponent on the back foot starting on turn 2. It's not going to be turn 1, but it is turn 2 basically in this particular case, and perhaps a little bit different than say what Strass Daddy has been working on with his tokens. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. He's been doing awesome with that pile. We're really trying to ask the questions early. We want to stick something that the opponent really doesn't like, and we really want to attack with it every turn if possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yep. I think Exalted is huge. Like when you're playing a tempo strategy where every turn you give your opponent is another turn for them to make another land drop and cast their One Ring or whatever big creature or threat or whatever it is. That's one turn we don't want to give them. So attacking early, taxing early, putting Knight sideways as often as possible is really how we get there.
That's right. Okay, so why green white? Like, why are we not playing a splash here? Let's just state the obvious. You get to play with basics. Uh, 3 of them, to be precise, and you can cast all of your spells on those basics. Similarly, when you're using your own lands as a resource, that means the ones that remain, the ones that you're not blowing up, Whither and Wentz, yeah, that are not being blown up, you want those to not get blown up, and then you get janked out of the game later. Hopefully the opponent doesn't think that's a good idea, but sometimes they stabilize, they take out your threat, you've gone down some lands, and now all of a sudden you're sitting there with a plateau or something. That doesn't happen if you have a forest or a plains or both.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that's really good about this is you're more likely to be able to get a at least one basic in front of a blood moon effect. If they cast it on their turn one, sometimes there's nothing you can do about that, but they don't always have it, and they might even board out the blood moon anyway after they find out you have some basics here.
I
Any
wish.
so much more is going to be said why green white, but like this is like the fundamental foundation is that Phil Gallagher of Thraben You talked about this. You want to be able to cast your spells, and when you're on just green white, guess what? You're going to be able to cast those spells most of the time. The other color combinations is really hard. Some of the time you will unfortunately lose to your own mana. Clips, what are your thoughts on Maverick's mana generally?
I think our map I think our mana is horrible, even on green white. We don't have cantrips. Once upon a time, right? But you have to have that in your opening hand, or else it's a bad card. Compared to other mid-range strategies that aren't utilizing cantrips, you have taxes, which is now a white deck, sometimes with black or with red, but never three colors. They don't run any utility lands that are colorless like we do, except for Wasteland. And then if they're on mono white, they use Port, which is their second color. There's lands, which is usually Mox, Diamond. There's just not, and then there's all these Ancient Tombs, Dobby decks. I feel like there's a lot of mid-range decks that are like more 1 to 2 colors out there. I think the best question is asking, why are you splashing and defaulting to 2 colors? If you look at the best players historically across Magic, they've always opted for less colors for consistency. So you have less variance, more control, less opportunities to dive to your own mana base. I personally like the Black Splash. I think it's really fun. There's some cool tools you get, but we've all had experiences where you have to awkwardly fetch around Wasteland, or you only have a Savannah and not a Bayou, and then you draw a Abrupt Decay or a Grist, and then you're just sitting at it, and that was a lost turn right there, and you can't cast your spells. And if you can, the way I look at it is, if you can win with 2 colors, then you don't need to splash. Whether that's a meta thing or a skill thing or a local meta thing, I think that's always where you have to start, and maximizing your win potential through skill and understanding the meta before you start going around and splashing.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so the Kingpin had a question about this, which we naturally had come to this one anyway, which is, so why without the splash? I think there's 2 other good reasons besides just casting your spells. One is you have more flexibility in utility land choices. It's very hard to fit in, say, a Bojuka Bog if you're trying to play 3 colors. For example, I was chattering the other day about my losing the game because I could not find red mana on turn 3, and there was some interesting talk about how to improve that, maybe go down some utility lands for that particular version. But so you have a little bit of flexibility here on the utility lands. We're going to talk at the very end about the most specific, most recent build of this. And the other is that most, but not all, of the effects are already in colors. So I have a couple of examples, and unfortunately I did not make slides for these. But one is, all right, obviously I think Maverick has a pretty good game plan against Merit Lage, but you need an Edict, there's Run Afoul, or Pick Your Poison. Pyroblast, there's Choke. Not exactly the same, but similar idea. Fatal Push, that's a really efficient spell. So is Dismember, and that one can be played in just green-white. Opposition Agent, I got one example here, Aven Mind Sensor. That's another conversation entirely that's not even covered here about what bears to play. But 3 mana bears are a tough plan. They're spicy 1 or 2 ofs. Yeah, any other thoughts about green-white's kind of weakness against certain effects?
I agree with everything you said. I think there's usually a slightly worse version of a similar effect in green whites. But I think the question comes back to, why aren't you splashing? It should be, why are you splashing? Because you should always start from a green white core, and then you have to justify why you're splashing. And whatever that justification is, whether that's merit or not, I think you need a reason to slash, other than just assuming that green white is the alternative.
Yeah, okay, so let's get to that. And Kingpin, there are probably more examples that I haven't thought of, but most effects can be found mostly in green white. I have specific thoughts when we go through the list, because I'm really high on Prismatic Ending right now, for example, because I had misevaluated how to use that card. But anyway, so Splash should have reason. Yes, okay, here we go. Yeah, to me, critical sideboard cards or execute the the game plan better, the core game plan, the tempo game plan we were talking about, or both. Here's one critical sideboard card, Pyroblast. Another one, some people really like Thoughtseize. They offer a similar conceptual role. They both involve taking a turn off or holding up mana to do a thing. And then the other reason here, and I really want to be thoughtful about this here because I think it's cool to splash, but if you want to play Jund, and conceptual Jund, this is my hobby horse, so I keep pounding the table on this. You want to play these really efficient 2-for-1 value effects. I am not sure that Maverick is the best possible place to play Jund. You can do it. I have certainly done it. I've actually almost had more success playing Jund playing actual Jund. Yeah, the prismatic ending renaissance. Chris, did you have any thoughts here on Maverick as Jund?
Yeah, I lived that for the last half. But I know what you were talking about, so I'll take that from where I think you were. There was, on the splash note, though, like you mentioned, Thoughtseize and Pyroblast, just taking some quick math from I would say, a very good player to base off when it comes to mana math on a similar deck would be Cradle Control, and Hello Newton, who's created that deck, that very well to his deck. I'm looking at 12 ways to fetch turn 1 black source plus once upon time. The average Maverick mana base for Abzan, I think, is like 7 fetch lands, Bayou, a scrub land, right? So that would be 9 ways to fetch turn 1 black source. If you're like, I would say less greedy, I see second Bayou, or sometimes an 8th fetch, but that would put you to 10. So that's a pretty significant difference. Was that like 10 to 12 is like around like 17% or something like that less. But to be able to have the mana base to support 3 colors, I don't think is free when you're playing Wasteland and all these other utility lands. But to your point on the Jund shell, I think that there's some players who have learned to adapt that very well. Shout out Strass Daddy, Strassman, who's done very well in the past with Punishing Saga Maverick. And I think right now he's more favoring the Mardu Tokens deck, which I think fits into that play strategy even more of being a Jund deck that's like capitalizing on these 2-for-1s and these let's put it this way, these threats that are very mana efficient and do a lot for the cost. And I think his Maverick as a core just doesn't really have that. Like Knight of the Reliquary, if you're going to play Knight of the Reliquary, let's just even take out THALIA. Everyone's on THALIA. Like Noble Hierarch is not a good Magic card again. Yeah. Like that has, it's not a good card past turn 1, maybe turn 2 if you're playing against Builder. Knight of the Reliquary is not a value card anymore. It's really being used to tap sideways. It doesn't replace itself that well unless you get a Canopy Land or a Talon Gates, but it's not a value threat. Fable the Mirror Breaker, it has way more value to it. Broadside Bombardiers is more valuable. Endurance is more valuable because as an ETB, that's very relevant in this format. Barrowgoyf would be like a more value-oriented, where if you untap and you connect, you can accrue some value there. And Maverick's core stuff, like Hate Bears that you're tutoring up, and Mana Dorks and Neither Reliquary, like just don't have that value to them inherently. I think Maverick needs some of that to an extent. Like Fiend Artisan is what some people use, Stoneforge Mystic, Punishing Fire. These are all like mana sinks to create some sort of grind. But I think there's an argument to, if you're going to play Jund, what is white even giving you? Like removal is plentiful in all colors now. And Snuff Out in black. Again, using Cradle Control and Helen Newton, he's gotten by without Swords of Plowshares. Like he doesn't slash white for Swords of Plowshares, right? So if you're playing Jund, my argument or my thinking would be like, why are you even splashing white when you could just drop Knight of the Reliquary for White of the Reliquary and play Thoughtseize and Swords of Plowshares or something like that, or just red cards, Fable the Mirror Breaker, Fury. Like Painter, I would say, has more value in Jundishness than Maverick does, or like Death and Taxes. I think we're fighting the wrong battle.
I think you can build it in a Jundish direction, and again, people have had some success with it for sure. So again, we're not trying to just like totally trash on this or anything. We're just trying to offer this like other way of thinking about it to play this other way. And yeah, I'm gonna have more to say about this in the red version at some future time, but not today. We're not really gonna try and Jund too much here. We're gonna try and keep the opponent off base, and we're gonna try and finish the game, and we're gonna try and do it with just green white.
Yeah. There are some people who have done on the other side of the coin. There are people who have done well. Harry 1232, Achilles 27. These are people who have done pretty well with it in the past. Or now Wasabi Pride Mage.
Yeah.
That's an awesome name. On the Discord, I put up a 5-0 recently. So it's definitely doable. And I think it's a really I think it's personally because you get to play a huge toolbox with Plague Engineer and Opposition Agent. So I am naturally inclined to do it. I think every Maverick player wants the toolbox to some extent. That's why we probably started with this deck. But I personally have not had a lot of success trying to grind out other decks in 2024. And I think it's more attuned to the Maverick cards that we're already playing to try and go more this tempo aggro strategy.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so moving on from Jund. All right, why Stoneforge Mystic? I'll let you just rip on this one because I was very surprised when people were being like, "Yes, we should play it," and only 2 copies and so on. So let's talk through some of these points here. Why Stoneforge Mystic?
Honestly, Gary, the Stoneforge is really bad. It's just a 1/2 squire. I don't think anyone should play. No, I'm just kidding. No, if you know me, I love Stoneforge. I think a little tongue in cheek, but going to Maverick theory, and we talked about playing this aggro tempo strategy. There is some merit to having some sort of grind package to it, and so Stoneforge is a nice way to check a lot of boxes for the deck.
Hello, everybody.
Gary, 1, 2, 3, 2.
You came
going
to
on? We just
the right spot. We are talking about why Stoneforge Mystic and the numbers and all that stuff.
Yo, Strass Daddy.
Hey, Strass.
Awesome. Thanks for the raid. Hope it went well with White, the Reliquary. Harry, we gave you a shout out just now for Fardas and Maverick and having some good results on that. But coming back to Stoneforge Mystic, I think it checks a lot of boxes for green-white. Start with the more common one, Fiend Artisan. I don't think Fiend Artisan plays that well in green-white. I think it's more of a black splash because of the casting cost, and then you get Bowmasters and Grist are probably the best tutor targets with it. But Stoneforge checks a lot of boxes. It's a 2-mana play that puts, again, we talked about tempo and putting pressure on your opponent, historically been known as a tempo negative card. But I would argue it's a little bit more than that because it does put some pressure on your opponent to guess whether you have another equipment like Cauldra or Batterskull in your hand. And it also makes them respect. If they have a counter spell, for example, and they're trying to save it, and you get a sort of Fire Ice against the Delver, they have to kill the Stoneforge or else you're going to cheat it into play and start making everything a threat. It creates a small toolbox for the utility that we're looking for in Maverick. We can only play so many removal spells as a deck that's not using Brainstorm and cantrips and 2-for-1s like Teferi. We really have every plow is precious to us, and so GT really can just mow down other creature strategies like Nadu, Death and Taxes, Cradle Control. GT is just still a house. It's not what it was, but people don't respect it, and it puts a ton of pressure on the opponents. And then Fire and Ices. Oh, go ahead.
So I think let's talk about the sword choices just a second here. I was also going to say this here.
My bad.
What I have found is that you want a critical mass of cards that you can cast on turn 2 off basics that really put the opponent on the back foot. And between the Thalia, which we're going to talk about in a little bit here, the Stoneforge Mystic, and your Knights of the Reliquary, which in theory could be cast on turn 2 as well, it just gives you just the right amount to have that nice follow-up after on your turn 2 here. And I found that one of the things that I was mistaken with when I first started doing this, because I really was always on a splash before as well, and I'm sure I'll be back, is that this card it's like Tameo in a way, the new Tameo. It's like a giant distraction that keeps the opponent is going to worry about it. They're going to focus their removal on it. They might have to waste a Thoughtseize discarding a sword from your hand or whatever. And that's time that they're not messing with, your Thalia or whatever else is there on the battlefield. And then of course, that sword or whatever, if and when it gets down on the battlefield, it just sits there, turning anything into something that can help you dig back into the game or finish the game later. So it's just very flexible and a lot of stuff. And all of these swords can be cast, of course, on their own. And so why just 2 copies? This is really interesting to me. Why on your list do you have just 2 copies?
Sorry for getting ahead earlier. I was just getting so excited to talk about Stoneforge Mystic.
Yeah.
But the other two things I want to add to what you said, which was great, and you broke that down really well, was that one, Stoneforge. So we talked about leaning into an aggressive tempo-based strategy for Maverick, and that's what we're going with green white, and to talk about Maverick today. But because of that, we want to utilize as little slots as possible to grind the mid-range plan and use as many slots as possible to leverage this tempo and wasteland focused strategy. So Stoneforge Mystic does that in a pretty compact way. For me, it's 4 slots to create this kind of background grind package that's very castable throughout the game if you draw it naturally. And then the other thing too is we talked about how if you're trying to grind in Maverick and go for this mid-range or long game plan, you have a lot of really bad dead top decks. So Delver has way more better top decks and grinds better than Maverick, I would say. Delver has 8 cantrips. They have 3 Murktides. They have 4 DRCs, 2 Brazen Borrowers. Those are 2-for-1s. Like right there, that's 17 slots or something, 18 slots. So they could draw that at any time. Versus us, it's 4 Zenith and maybe a few of the top end threats. Stoneforge, that's 8 good top decks if you're not including removal for just threat. Being able to turn late game Noble Hierarchs, which Dorks would play 5 of, or dead Hate Bears, or like a Script Ranger, which is just a 1/1, into actual threats with equipment is very core to be able to put pressure on your opponent and force them to use removal on creatures that you don't care about at that state of the game.
All excellent points. So let's talk about the 2 sword choices here. All right. Like I mentioned also, these are both castable on turn 2. Not if Thalia is in play with the Swords of Fire and Ice, but the Umezawa's Jitte, even if Thalia isn't played, typically is castable on turn 2 as well. The first thing here is that these are just castable. Cauldra, whatever, is not. And at least in my experience, it turns out people were very into Psychic Frog. I'm sure you might have heard about this card. A lot of times the game was over or pseudo over if it connected even a single time. That's what these things do too as well. And if you connect even once with these, then against most fair strategies, the game's basically over. The opponent probably won't be able to catch up. So do you want to talk a little bit more about these specific choices?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I agree with you. I think these cards put you, when you're at parity or near parity, put you very far ahead unless they have an instant artifact answer, which most decks don't really run these days outside of like Prismatic Ending out of Jeskai Control, which is like nowhere to be seen right now. But, and then going off your 2 Stoneforge number, I think it's just with time, that's where it's been. I think I started with some of Herzog's lists and Julian's lists from back in the day, and they usually ran 2 Stoneforge for equipment. I've dropped down to 2 from the Light and Shadow, rest in peace. Love that card, but not as suited right now. But yeah, it's just about creating space and using Stoneforge as like a supplemental strategy to the main Maverick strategy. But yeah, Jitte Honorary Sword Kingpin. Jitte creates board control so that we can preserve our spot removal and not have to play too much spot removal. If you played Maverick for a long time and you played a lot of spot removal, you probably realized intuitively or literally that the more spot removal you play against creature decks does not equate to more wins. There is a sweet spot there because they just have diminishing returns. So like, for example, I played against Painter a few weeks ago with an Abzan list without Stoneforge and like Bowmasters and stuff. And I played all the best removal spells. I played like 12 removal spells. And I lost that game because like I couldn't grind and they just had 2-for-1s and 3-for-1s like Fury and Dragon's Rage engine thing. But the point I was going at that is Jitte puts a lot of pressure, creates board control that you don't have to devote more slots to, and it has to be answered. So Jitte can pick out 2 creatures that makes your Stoneforge into a 3-for-1. And Sword of Fire and Ice is a lot of pressure for those non-creature matchups or even the creature matchups where I think you said it, Gary, but if you get one hit in with Sword of Fire and Ice against a fair deck and you're at parity or near parity, it's very hard to lose. You usually 3-for-1 them, usually ping the guy so they're down a card. You drew a card, you're up a card, and you did at least 4 damage or something. So you're also clocking them. And so it's a nice utility sword that isn't dead against combo game 1, makes people respect your Birds of Paradise, your like a Gaddock Teague or a Thalia that would normally be like useless in the matchup, and make some point removal at those kind of cards instead of like your Knight of the Reliquary.
That's right. These are old cards. Everybody knows about them. They still have some nice value there. You do have to be a little careful when you hit with the Sword of Fire and Ice, and for some reason they did not block with an Orcs. I'm going to talk a bit more about
Mm.
Orcs a little bit here in the future here. All right, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this here because I don't want to bash on these strategies, and I'm not. They have a lot of great success. What about living weapons here? Cauldron, pre-war, formal wear. Really, Maverick does not have the same synergy as some of these more recent taxes list. If something goes wrong, you may have a really hard time getting to 7 mana. The thing gets stuck in hand. The Cauldron also doesn't have an effect on the game. It doesn't add mana. It doesn't disrupt the opponent. It doesn't have activated abilities of its own. You can't fling it with a broadside bombardier for 12 damage or whatever it is that the
Pretty
Taxes
sweet.
players are up to these days. And you can't really fix the problem with Flicker Wisps and Thalias and all these other things either. I maybe there's a way you could fundamentally rebuild the list around these cards, but I just don't think they have quite the right synergy here. Is really why we're not using these cards as
Hmm.
much. Batterskull, let's just not talk about that one at all because
I love
it's
Batterskull.
not well
Whoa,
decided.
whoa, I love Batterskull. That's my third equipment for when I do decide to play a third equipment. I really do Batterskull. It's usually a space issue, and like right now I'm playing Questing Race over that because of Tameo.
Yeah,
But I do think Batterskull's sweet because you can actually cast it and puts a lot of pressure on the opponent.
that's right. That's right. So anyway, these cards are great if you have these other things around them, and we don't have those things, and we're trying to use the things we do have.
Hmm.
Also, if Cauldron like hits once, the game is not over. Sometimes they just answer it.
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay, Thalia. This
Yep.
has been a very hot topic lately. I have come full circle on this. Just going to very mini rant here. I was like, okay, I'm going to play less of it. Okay, no, I'm going to play a Hushbringer to stop the orcs. No, I'm going to go maximize on Mother of Runes to protect the Thalia. This is just the most disruptive creature for so many reasons. It attacks and blocks best. It has tricks with the Umazawa's Jitte. It'll deal combat damage first, and then you can do other effects in the thing. Yes, Spirit of the Labyrinth also stops the opponent from digging, but not on another turn. It doesn't attack as well because it doesn't have First Strike. It doesn't block as well because it doesn't have First Strike. I've had played a Spirit of the Labyrinth, my opponent just casts a Fatal Push on it for the full 1 mana instead of 2. This card just disrupts
Hmm.
by far the most, in my opinion.
Hmm.
I'm talking a little bit about orcs as well. Yes, the orcs do answer this card. They answer it very cleanly. They answer it super cleanly if you include just two basics. There's a Troll of Khazad Doom. It gets a basic swamp, and then now you're getting pinged, and this thing goes down, and now you got these two things sitting on the battlefield, and it's really annoying. I agree. However, the opponent still has to spend that 2 mana to answer that thing, and that those orcs don't really do anything on the battlefield. They double fog you some of the time, but this card just is very important to disrupting the opponent. It's a combo with the
Hmm.
wastelands. I could go on and on. I I, I think the mistake was okay. There was orcs, so let's go down on this card. No, we have to go up on this card. It just
Hmm.
leans the most into the way in which the Maverick game plan disrupts. That's my opinion.
No, I think that you said everything very well, and that I would have said too. I think Thalia some supplements. Again, we're playing. If you're tuning in from stresses, we talked about leaning into this tempo strategy. We're trying to play this tempo strategy and leverage wastelands as a tool, which means we're trying to create mana parity or sorry disparity against our opponents. And Thalia leverages that more than something like Spirit of the Labyrinth, as well as just being a little bit more beefy and able to survive in combat versus like an orc token that's already sitting there. She just supports it. I think there's other stuff too, like when your opponent taps out to cast something, your spells are now uncastable or uncounterable for the turn. That's really huge. She does a lot of little things in this deck, and I think I'm going to quote the myth, the legend, Tom Herzog, who's like one of the fathers of Maverick. And there's a really good interview we're going to post about him later, but he goes into how the Maverick deck starts with Thalia. Like that is like the core part of the strategy and essential to the deck surviving. And that's pretty sweet. We're probably the best Thalia deck. Nowadays doesn't matter. It means a lot less. But we leverage Thalia more than any other strategy right now. And she does still have a powerful effect in a deck in a format that's dominated by like Lotus Petal and Brainstorm and Force of Will.
That's right. Just you are going to jank out the opponent some of the time just because people aren't playing Thalia anymore. And you play a Thalia and then they can't do anything. That happened to me just recently on Doomsday. I've actually started to come to the conclusion that Doomsday versus Maverick is one of the more interesting matchups out there. Yeah,
Hmm.
just so much to say about this. I personally feel it's four because if they destroy a Thalia, then there's another one. Now, your opponent will cast Orcish Bowmasters, ping your thing. Orcish Bowmasters again, ping another thing. And then they'll cast a third one. And then they'll actually have 8-9 power in the battlefield and have taken out all your guys. You know what? That happens. I don't really know what to say about that. It's just like,
I think no, that's a good point because people are very scared of Bowmaster. Like I actually lost to Death Shadow this morning in probably like one of the more favorable matchups for Maverick because he went triple work, triple fatal push. Didn't matter what I did, right? I think understanding that like multiple Bowmasters like that in the early turns is equivalent to get going like Delver, DRC, two Dazes back up. Like no one's beating that start. No fair deck is going to beat that kind of Delver start. And so I think we should understand that with orc strategies, especially the tempo orc strategies, like you're just not going to beat a triple orc start or
but they're not
double
going to
orc
have
plus
that.
like double wasteland.
They're not going to have that. And they're going to want to dig. And guess what? Costs things to dig on. Thanks,
Yep.
all those spells cost two, which is twice as much as one. Yeah, I
Tempo.
suggest everybody play four Thalia, even in your Jund lists. Maybe, well, maybe not in the Jund lists. Okay, enough about Jund. We already talked about Jund. Okay, I feel the least certain about this. I feel like there is the least agreement. I wouldn't say there's disagreement, but just this is just unsettled. How many Mother of Runes should you play? I have played three. I have played zero. Lorcac played four and a Safekeeper. Right now I'm on two. I will say the reason I like two is I really want to cast it on turn one, and I really don't want to see the card again. But I don't really want to cast it on turn one most of the time either. It just gives me that nice I'm liking two. But obviously, this here is going to allow you to be more likely to equip your sword. It's going to allow you to be more likely to get your sword to connect. This is going to save your Thalia from an orc. And all these
Yeah.
things that obviously this is an old card. It's almost like card advantage if it's cast on turn one, not answered right away. It's also not as good as it used to be in many other ways too. There is just a lot more
Mm.
incidental removal. There's Plague Engineer, there's Orcs, like has been said. Doesn't do anything versus colorless. What do you think about the numbers here? I don't have a whole lot to say about this here. I just feel like it's a critical mass of cards to cast on turn one, or to double spell on
Hmm.
turn two, or to eat a daze, cast a Thalia on turn two, and then follow it up with this or something.
Yeah. Yeah. I would add to that. I think Mom puts a lot of pressure on opponents' removal. So let's say you're going against Delver and you turn one Mom. Now they can't play a DRC. Like they want to do DRC bubble. Like now they can't. They have to bolt it, which puts them a turn behind. Or they can't cantrip for their land drop, and then that lets you wasteland them because they have to one lander. There's a lot of spots where Mom puts a lot of pressure. Where you're playing against DNT and they don't have a plow and they have to solitude it. That's such a good trade for one mana. Pitch Solitude, or against Moonstomping, and that's Pitch Fury, or like Painter. There's some really good trades you can get with Mom when you ignore Eldrazi, which you probably should if you're playing Maverick. But I
Yeah.
think that I'm on this 3 or 4 Mom right now. I was been a 2 for a long time and like slowly gone up. I think that if we're again leaning into this tempo focused strategy where we are trying to get underneath opponents, we need to be playing less 3 drops and more 1 and 2 drops. And so Maverick doesn't have a lot of disruptive 2 drops outside of Thalia in green white. Bowmaster, if you're splashing, but I don't know if that's really a disruptive card. It's more of like a tempo threat. But Mom lets you critical mass earlier on, and it's something that has to be respected by all fair decks right now, and lets you play Protect the Queen in post-board games when you're playing against an unfair or backup unfair strategy where you want to Painter and Outland Liberator and like Collector Oof. Like you can sit behind a Mom and a Collector Oof and get pretty far and stabilize, like drop a couple nights. So I think she does do some stuff. And I do shout out to Lorcac, who did very well in the EW. I think he's the best performing Maverick list in EW North America. But I respect that guy a ton. I think he's very underrated in the community, and I think he's always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. And he's on 4 Mom, which made me really reconsider my Mom count. If he's on 4 Mom, I feel like I need a good reason not to be.
Yeah, that's he is really, uh, yeah. I think it's worth listening to him. He's got a lot of really cool ideas, and he's operating on another plane sometimes. Okay, all right. So this is one of my hobby horses here. Mavis Toolbox. No, Knight from Hand. Yes, there is a toolbox, and yes, you can get critical mass consistently. But really, for playing a tempo game plan where you're stopping almost at 3 on the curve, that really limits your ability to get fancy with zenithing for really a whole lot more than 2. You don't really want to be zenithing for 1, because that's a really awkward play. Sometimes you do that because you need to, and that's good.
Mm-hmm.
But really, I don't think if you're considering this tempo game plan, you don't want to be spending extra mana and taking another turn to have to zenith for something. And so you really want to be playing these cards from hand most of the time. So in regards to the toolbox, I have come to the conclusion that for tempo, you want to have turn 2 plays off of a noble hierarch that plug the biggest of holes. You have to stop that 8/8 Murktide Regent in the air. You've got to stop the One Ring. You don't want them to cast a storm spell. And it has to, these things really need to absolutely put the game to a total halt in your favor, or it's not always worth the mana to do it. And if you're in green-white, these things can also carry a sword. This is not the definitive list of one-ofs. These are the ones that we're largely liking right now. Shave Greenstone Zenith. That is a very interesting idea. See, I like what people are experimenting. That's a thought. That's for darn sure. Zenith is very important to give you a critical mass of turn 1 plays. That would be interesting, but you know what? What's it called? Loam plays 2 Greenstone Zenith, or 1 sometimes. Yeah, so anyway, I think you're plugging the biggest holes, just completely stopping the opponent's game plan with an for a Teague. And of course, these things can carry a sword as well, so my personal, I think we'll talk a bit about this more when we look at the more recent version of the list, but I think there's an interesting theory going around right now as to whether or not these even all belong in the main, or which ones belong in the main. So we'll talk about that later, but any other thoughts about this here?
Yeah, I really like your meme of turn 2 Knight from Hand. I think that the idea of Zenith is a tempo negative card. That's the cost of playing Zenith. You have to play 1 more mana. So like a 3 mana to get a 2/2 bear that shuts off artifacts has to be very good in that situation to be worth it. Like you said, turn 2, Green Suns for 2 is more of a defensive play than an aggressive one with the current state of Maverick. We'll see what the Tiger thing does, if anything. But it ends up either getting you mana against mana denial strategies, or like you basically want a Zenith if you're going to die that turn. So like Zenithing for a hate bear if you're going to die. I don't mean that. I mean that literally, or not literally death, but or like you're going against Delver and they're like aggressively attacking your mana, and you're like, I need to Zenith right now for Arbor or Noble Hierarch in order to play the game and not get mana denied out of this game. Otherwise, your Zeniths are they're bad cards, and you're trying to hopefully you can save them for the end and start slamming Knights and Excavators and stuff like that. But I do think that the turn 2 Knight from Hand is really important, because when we leverage Maverick as a tempo strategy instead of a Zenith toolbox strategy, that means we want to see turn 2 Knight more often. And turn 2 Knight is 20 times better than a turn 3 Knight, because a turn 2 Waste or turn 3 Wasteland is much more impactful in this format than a turn 4 Wasteland, which is often too late. So being able to do that is huge.
This came to mind. I actually forgot to put this in the material here. But what is Ramunap Excavator? It's actually the 5th Knight from Hand.
Yes, it is. No, absolutely.
That's really what it is. You think you're going to Crucible your worlds your opponent out of the game, but really you're just like, okay, I want to just slam the door and just cut them off of mana even to get one more time. So, yeah.
Yeah. Shout out to my buddy Carador. And I've worked very hard over this last year to convince him this, but I think that Excavator is core to the Maverick strategy. I don't think it's a flex spot because of that mana denial and being able to do lines like that. Like Excavator is so good, not just for double wastelanding, but to just continually wasteland people out of the game. Plus you have a THALIA out, and Mally's can't trip anymore. It doesn't matter like what else is going on unless there's like a lethal Murktide. Like you can really lock people up with that. In addition to some value plays with Excavator, it's always going to be like a 2-for-1 if you can set it up like that. I think Excavator is core to Maverick and is like an important thing to lean into when you're going for this tempo strategy. And I've even lately been actually dropping the fourth knight and leaving an excavator against decks where you wouldn't think it would be good, like Delver, just because you want some sort of late game value engine that, again, it's a very small opportunity cost to like play one silver bullet as a value engine a late game instead of more than that. Excavator sweet.
Awesome, awesome. And of course, all these things can carry a sword because that's what you got. So any of these guys can turn into a thing. Scrib Ranger, way better from
Yep.
hand. Frenzy Trapbreaker, Outland Liberator, lots been talked about that. That is a really expensive disenchant, but it's a one card combo against Urza Saga strategies a lot of the time because they're not
Mm-hmm.
casting a spell, they're spending mana on their Urza Saga. So anyway, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on a little bit here, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, many choices at 3. This is the time is a flat circle. We talk about which things to cast on 3, grist, endurance, all this stuff. There's this cat that I will briefly talk about here. I think that if it's 3, it needs to be an even bigger hammer. It's
Mm-hmm.
got to somehow be even more impactful than the Teague or whatever, or somehow be a thing that you're fine not seeing most of the time and digging back into the game, or I don't even know how to exactly put this. But these cards don't work early or mid game most of the time. Endurance is the exception here. So yeah, I at least for tempo, these cards are not very efficient for what we're trying to do, basically. And I believe we
Mm-hmm.
mostly aligned on endurance, both because it bails you out of the game against random graveyard stuff, and it's very, very impactful versus Delver. But yeah, a lot can be debated here. I just want to let me just briefly talk about this cat. I've actually been liking this card in the sideboard as of lately because it is like a one card thing. It's like a one card choke in a weird way because it allows you to. But yeah, any thoughts about this clips here on these threes?
Tracker, I love Tracker. I'm not playing her right now because of the Bowmasters situation, but I give Tracker a lot of credit going back to Julian from It's Julian. He's, I think, another forefather of Maverick, and he's basically gone on record saying Tracker is core and never back down from that. So I respect Tracker a lot, and I respect him a lot as a Maverick player. So I think that, yeah, I hate how good Endurance is. I really do. Like, I don't want to run Endurance because it has zero synergy with Maverick, but it's really good, and I'm always like trying to play it, not play it, and then I end up playing more and more of them. But I think, going back to this tempo thing, and back to this Gen mid-range deck, I see most Maverick lists probably running like somewhere like around 10, give or take one or two, 3 drops, if not 4 drops. And I think the question I would pose to that is, what is your game plan there? If you're playing 10 3 drops in this deck that only runs 13 green sources or less, and then these very fragile mana dorks as mana sources and colored mana sources in a Bowmaster world, what are you doing when you get to 3 mana? Are you winning the game with these threats, or are you going to just get out tempoed? And I think those 3 drop slots outside of Knight have to be very value oriented to make them work. Like a lot of ETB value and stuff like that when you look at the rest of the format. I think I think Maverick players in general, including myself, just need to give more thought to dropping 3 drops and trying to play more 1s and 2s so that we can get under decks and wasteland them.
At least within this tempo oriented version of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I've talked a lot about this cat. We'll talk about it again someday. But I've been liking it. It's a low cost inclusion in the sideboard that's good against control, but nobody plays control, so whatever. More on that later. Lands, and more lands. We didn't really talk about the mana base that much outside of the 3 basics because that is, other than that, the mana base is quite similar even to the splash versions. So I've noticed that Clips, you like 22 plus Dryad Arbor instead of 23. Is there a reason for that, or is that just a heuristic you developed?
I wouldn't say I'm a master, but I think it's just been like from endless leagues and testing and stuff like that. I was on 22 for a long time, thinking that I'd do 22. This is before Surveil Lands, because I count those as half a land. But I was on 22 for a long time just because without the splash, I think I could get away with that with 5 dorks. And historically, Maverick decks have been on 22 lands. If you go back and you look, like I said, Julian, Herzog, like these guys typically ran 22 lands, 13 to 14 green sources at least. But I found that I lose a lot more games due to mulliganing for lands. than I do losing from flood. And so I've gone up to I would say 22 and a half with surveil land, trying to find that sweet spot there. So that's just basically TLDR. That's just based on feel. and I think the other point to that too is that compared to the good old glory days of Maverick when they were on 22 lands, there's so much more removal for mana dorks these days. It's not just, oh, you play 4 plows and 3 snapcasters. It's okay, you play 4 plows, 4 endings, 4 wraths, or you're playing like 4 fatal pushes and bolts plus 4 bowmasters. There's so many ways to kill mana dorks that I think prioritizing land drops a little bit more is more valuable.
Yeah, so we've arrived here. We're getting very close to the end of this material here. We can take a look at the list itself. We got Horizon lands, you got Surveil lands, you got your dual and basics count, flex slots, fetch mix, and Caracas. And on the fetch mix thing, I have recently been throwing in one more, a 5th land that can find basic planes. I don't know if that's right or not, but it's been something I've been experimenting with lately. So yeah, I think we'll talk about more of that when we take a look at the list here. Hang on one moment. Lands choices. Okay. Yeah. So the flex, at least when it comes to flex choices here, there's really not a lot of room. It's like Bajuka Bog or Talon Gates really, or maybe a Canopy. Like for example, on the flex spot, I've been thinking about in a red version, should it just be a basic mountain to play? So there's not a lot of room to be honest when it comes to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so these are 3 things we're gonna find. We did recover the links for these, and we'll send these out. I did get 5 or 6 questions here, so let's bring those up one at a time. So first question here, new to Maverick, so I'm wondering how threat assessment plays a role in play patterns of GW equipped versions of the deck. I am interpreting that question to mean I had noticed that in the past I have, how do I put this? Yeah, I've had too many removal spells and it just hasn't really worked out very well. Okay, I'm not answering this question very well. Did, Thoughts here?
Yeah, I think I understand what they're saying. I think they're going off. I'm blanking on that famous guy's name, but the Who's the Beatdown article.
Oh,
That's how I'm interpreting it. Threat assessment plays a role. Actually, maybe not. Maybe they're talking about threat assessment in the creatures, but a threat assessment as far as Who's the Beatdown.
mm-hmm.
I've said a lot about Maverick being a tempo strategy, and I'm actually gonna sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I probably play the role more than I allude to. But I do think that you can still be a control and play a tempo strategy by making them answer your thing in order to continue pressuring you, like a collect roof against painter or something like that. But I think that I would just get the part. I don't think that plays a role in determining who's the beatdown. But there's a very delicate dance to it. Julian's Maverick is like sensitive, and so you're very much playing this tempo game where you are bouncing back and forth between developing your game plan, being proactive and threatening your opponent with proactive plays that they don't want you to untap with, like an Either Reliquary or Mother of Runes or Thalia or Outland Liberator, and playing this control role where you're trying to stick and untap with a Knight so you can start getting value and stuff like that. So I think it's hard to explain, and I think it comes with time and experience, and it's actually a really fun thing to explore when you're playing Maverick.
I agree. It makes it incredibly replayable. I don't know what's wrong with me and everybody in this small niche within a niche world, but for some reason, just figuring out that puzzle is really fun. I will say in the green-white version, because you're probably not playing main deck Abrupt Decays or something like that, you generally want to be using your pressure as a threat. Kind of which is what was said here. I'm not. I guess with green white, because you're packing less removal main, there are some times where the opponent has a Nadu. Okay, then you're going to want to make sure to see if you can somehow get a Jitte down quickly, so that you can keep the board clean from the stuff that they're going to do to get the Nadu down, just as one example.
Hmm.
Yeah. Uh,
Yeah, and Raf, I think that question was from Raf, but if we totally misunderstood your question and what you're asking, feel free to reach out to
yeah,
us.
just ask again.
Hopefully we can help.
Okay, with Maverick being a deck built with lots of different cards that are dead in some matchups, how do we make this up for in game one where Thalia is bad and you run four? Okay, should be mulliganing more. Okay, yeah, the answer is yes. Other content creators have said this. The London Mulligan is extremely powerful. You want to be utilizing that. If you know what your opponent is doing, then you're going to want to do that. If Thalia is not good, then you're just going to want to make an assessment of, hey, is it possible for me to win this game with Thalia just blocking and attacking and holding a sword or whatever? Then keep playing the game. If you don't think there's a way to win that particular game and Thalia isn't useful, then feel free to concede the game before you reveal, say, your equipment strategy, if that also turns out to be helpful. And that way your opponent doesn't know to expect it in game two. So ideally, if you're building it, you shouldn't have to mulligan too much. That's why it's built the way it is. But it's just really hard to pilot, which has been said a lot. I think that's my best answer to that question.
I love this question. Thank you so much for asking it, Raf, again. But I think that going back to what we're trying to do here, one on the London Mulligan thing you mentioned, Gary, I'm actually the opposite. And I say this, I'm not sure if it's a weakness or not, but I just rarely mulligan and I rarely go to five because I feel like we're already fighting an uphill battle with Maverick, choosing to play Maverick in 2024 and going to five cards in a deck that doesn't present a lot of individually threatening cards is very difficult to win against a fair deck. Now, if it's like an unfair deck, of course, you got to do that. But even that can be challenging because they thought sees you and you're like really down on resources. They can pick apart your hand without the redundancy of a 6 or 7 card hand. So I usually I'll sometimes keep just like a turn 2 Thalia and that could flip a turn 1 Plow and then a really slow start just so I can like cast all my spells because I've had those games where like you mulligan like a mediocre hand and then you go to 6 and it's Wasteland and Dryad Arbor and 5 Knights and it's just like, oh crap, like I got to go to 5 and then you're like, you keep a mediocre 5 and you just lose. So, but to his other question, this is my favorite part about Maverick is how can you as a player maximize these quote dead cards and leverage them as strengths against your opponent. For example, I recently played some games against Nadu Elves and Eldrazi, where Thalia won me the game and ideally the match in those sets, which would be generally known as one of the worst cards in that matchup. But I was able to use Thalia, namely as equipment and also with first strike to actually pressure the opponent and make them respect her. And I think that's the beauty of playing Stoneforge Mystic is it lets you turn these quote dead cards into threatening cards. Similar like Fiend Artisan is, I think, a more obvious example where you can turn your Thalia into a Knight of the Reliquary or a Grist, right? Like that's the obvious example, but that's hard when your Grist gets answered with like a Fatal Push or something. Like your equipment, you'll usually stick around for a while, and so you can use Thalia is probably one of the best equipment bearers if they don't have a Krakus because of First Strike, and a lot of people don't know how First Strike in GTA works, but you can stack the and it doesn't stack the triggers. It just works that way where you deal damage first and then you can ping some stuff off. Thalia always survives in combat, but there's some really sweet stuff there with using your dead cards with basically with equipment.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, all of this just comes with time, and I have to say because we're not playing Jund style cards, it is definitely a different mindset for sure.
Yeah.
Struggled finding post board answers for combo such as Sneak and Show and Reanimator. What are some tips you have for playing against these and play patterns that I should be looking for? Okay, this is the heuristic that I developed, and it took a long time for me to get to this point. I want to have 2 or 3 answers for those. Usually something in hand and something on the battlefield. That way, if one of them gets discarded, I still have a thing I can do. So, for example, a wasteland to blow up one of my opponent's lands is a thing. Thalia is another thing. What's it called? Fairy Macabre is another thing. So it just depends on how prevalent these are and how much you're going to want to put on the sideboard, because the art of sideboarding is something that changes week to week, day to day, match to match. It's a very heavily discussed thing, but it's just hard to do. Endurance is it just gives you critical mass of those things. Ooze and Curator, though, those are like your finishers. You're right. Just putting that in your
Mm.
hand isn't going to be enough. So what you want are some bridge cards to get you to that point. And that's how I like to think about it. I usually want two answers. So if one of them gets discarded or countered or something, then I have something else, and then I'm gonna hope that I have enough critical mass of other stuff to help me get through the matchup. At least that's how I think about
Um,
that one there.
yeah, I think that's yeah. I like that what you said about them being finishers too. In my experience, I'll be like completely honest. I would say these are both just very bad matchups. Sneak and Show in particular is very bad for Maverick these days. In the past, it was pretty good, if not favored, because your Knight of the Reliquary, you put in Knight, they put in Emrakul, you bounce it, and you have a 5/5 Knight, whatever, and they are like stuck with Emrakul in hand, unless they find Sneak and Show, and then you like Dolly Antique them, right? These days, Sneak and Show is so busted with their stuff that it's very hard to combat that. So like them putting in Atraxa and you put in Knight, it's very hard to win that from that position unless you're already like really far ahead and you can kill on that turn, which is usually pretty rare. And then they're also playing the One Ring now, which is like, and they play Magus of the Moon, like all these things that just like really stomp on Maverick. And some of the old school players even play like Pyroclasm, which also kills us. So I just think Sneak and Show is a bad matchup, and I wouldn't count too much to it. I think you can steal wins with like THALIA and
Yeah,
Wasteland,
Thalia is the one way to
but
steal wins there.
yeah, but generally speaking, you don't have a 2 mana hate bear that shuts off their deck in their primary strategy, and then that hurts number one. You get Liberator against Sneak and Show and Omnipresence. Like usually they can just play around that pretty easily when you're like Trickster on board. But I think that they also play basic lands. So like a combo deck that's playing basic lands with a turn 2 to 5 win is very difficult for Maverick to interact with on that level. So I don't count it much. I think maybe the red splash is a little bit more agency, but and then Reanimator, I'm personally convinced I'm like the either the worst player against Reanimator or the most unlucky, but I swear they always have a turn game three, keep 7, turn 1 unmask me, and then play like an Archon or like an attraction I lose. I think that's actually a kind of a hard matchup because usually the way it boils down, so like you look at Maverick, you're like, oh, I'm fine. I got 3 Endurances and 2 Fairy Macabres, and then I like will land a Keen-Eyed Curator on turn 2 or 3, and I untap it. I win. The reality in practice is the way it goes is that Mono Black Reanimator plays like Fatal Pushes and Orcish Bowmasters on the sideboard, so they start to interact with your hate pairs. And then the other thing that happens is usually, I don't know what the math is, someone could probably point it out, but if you have 5 free graveyard spells in your 75, you usually, unless you get a lucky opener where you get 2 in one hand, or in your hand or something, you usually end up with 1 in your opening hand, and especially by the time you mulligan. And so I think that the odds of them going turn 1 Thoughtseize, turn 2 Entomb Reanimate, or whatever with Dark Ritual like Animate Dead is higher than you being able to have multiple means of interaction by turn 2 while you're on the draw. I think on the play with Dahlia, it's very doable, but I think those games that usually pan out to you being on the draw game 3 because our combo deck can win game 1 against this fair strategy is like you have to get a little bit lucky unless you put more eggs in that basket, like run like 8 ley lines or something like that. And then to that point too, we're saying like Maverick is not a tier 1 strategy. That means we like ideally have to pick matches we're going to lose to, and ideally in a perfect world we'd have 20 card sideboards for us, so you'd have to pick what you lose to. And so I like, for me, like Sneak and Show, I don't really think it's redeemable with green white, so Reanimators in your meta would play more hate towards that, and that might be okay. And then also be aware of like when they try to do the Sneak and Show or the show and tell sideboard juke, that might not be beatable as well for some of those lines they have.
I would say that maybe it's because I just was playing stuff before I played Maverick a lot that really did fold to fast combo. But I feel like if they don't, if they cannot get me by my turn 2, they're done. So I feel like I'm favored versus combo. But that's just, I don't worry about it. Sometimes you get got, but if they can't get me by turn 2, they're toast. I am going to stop them from winning the
Yeah.
game. And I can choose to build my
Yes.
strategy to be more towards that or not. Okay, let's try and get
And
through
I
these
think
questions.
that also goes play draw. Sorry, I was gonna say play draw. And I think that's on the play, turn 2 Maverick can do some crazy stuff and put up some road barriers, but on the draw can be a little tricky. I think that's where Black Splash can be helpful for Thoughtseize.
It's just I'm almost putting the inverse fear in my opponents, and I actually look forward to facing Storm or something. I think Storm is
Nice.
a good matchup for Maverick, but I'm probably insane.
I agree.
Okay,
No, you're not.
looking at Mav as a deck that is a fair with Origins as the anti-Delver deck. Now that Delver is on the back foot, are there any new directions we can take? New buildup of the deck, Eternal green white, heavy white instead of green splash. Delver is actually no longer on the back foot and is very popular. Again,
I was gonna say.
uh, but imagining some world where Delver does take the back foot again, I will say that green white list that Lorcac is working on is something to behold, and despite containing all the same cards that we're talking about, plus some of the cards from Cradle Control, it's just really hard to pilot, and he's up to something. And I wish he would come stream or something and explain it to us. I don't really know how else to. So you can tune it mostly in the sideboard. For example, if it becomes a heavy ETB situation, you can play those Hushbringer effects. There are other hit pairs you can play. So I think that there are things you can do. This green white one is very optimized against Storm, and it's pretty decent versus Delver.
Yeah, I would say it's
Yeah.
pretty optimized against Delver for sure. Probably the cleanest if you can take advantage of outplaying your opponent. And then actually have been pretty, even since I dropped Choke, and I'm like the number one Choke lover, but I've actually been doing very well against fair blue strategies with my current configuration because they have a hard time with Stoneforge.
Yeah. So I think there's more creativity to be had here. Like with green white specifically, you could do some crazy stuff like play a Spirit Guide to come up a turn faster if you feel like that's really necessary or that turns out to be really important. There's other hate bears. You can change the sword package slightly. You can trim a Knight of the Reliquary. Right now, I'm not feeling like a strong reason to do most of those things, but I do think there's things we can do. There are times where you can't. I think in the Oko era where I was not playing Maverick, I was playing Cloud Post. There was not a lot you could do about it. I think it was also really hard for it to compete with Ren and Six, which just ping down all the guys. So there are some things that can make that really difficult. But yeah, that's another really tough question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't even know if you need to go to new directions, right? If it's working, there's no need to change.
And this really can work. And again, just going back to that very first slide, just pull that one up. For those of you that weren't here earlier, this is hard. It's going to be difficult. It's not going to be easy, but you're choosing to do it because it is hard. Like JFK and putting a man on the moon. So you're doing it because it's a fun puzzle to solve, because you want to be different, because you are favored versus some things like Storm or whatever. It just takes time, and it's hard, but it is very rewarding when it starts to work. Okay, budget options. This is a really tough one. Not really. I think you put yourself at a serious disadvantage playing somewhat of a disadvantage playing Shocks, because you are playing Tempo, so you're going to just barely get across the finish line. I would say the best thing you could do here is maybe play more basics. Maybe 3 forests, 2 plains, 1 duel. That might work. Unfortunately, you cannot do things like play like Razorverge Thicket or the Fastlands. And the reason is that you need to be able to sacrifice forests and plains. It's very hard to play Maverick on a budget, in my opinion. That is a tough one. Luckily, Savannah is probably the cheapest duel at this point.
Yeah, I think you can. I would say if you're on a budget, I'll straight up say, and I wish this wasn't true, but I don't think my build is playable without Cradle. I think Cradle is essential for the Stoneforge stuff because it's pretty expensive, and you get some really explosive stuff where you play a turn 2 Knight, and then turn 3 you play Stoneforge, and then you get Cradle, and you can like equip and smash the same turn, and that kind of lets the equipment really surprise and catch people off guard versus them having a whole turn to prepare for it. But I do think the best budget build is probably the lead Lorcax build. I think it's pretty budget friendly. He doesn't run Cradle. I think he's on 3 Savannah, and you could probably get away with 1 or 2 with Shocks or an extra Surveil land or something. So I think his is pretty reasonable. And obviously the core Maverick stuff is pretty cheap outside of Fetchlands and Wastelands, I think are the most expensive.
Yeah, everything else is really quite cheap. Greenstone Zenith is more expensive right now, but I don't think it will be forever because it's actually not being played that much in Modern. Yeah, it's really hard. Another thing that's come up a lot, and because we're not playing Scavenging Ooze specifically, and now we're on Keen-Eyed Curator, there is a case to be made for one Ancient Tomb. It, I still think the Cradle is better. It's got more upside. It obviously doesn't damage yourself, and it makes green mana. But the Ancient Tomb can be randomly better on turn 2, for example, just from hand. And
Yeah.
it can also have you go up mana a little bit to help equip a thing. It's not a perfect
Yeah.
analogy, but it's something you could do. Of course, Ancient Tomb's not cheap either.
That's a good point. I forgot about that part. Yeah, and then I think you do a lot of racing with Maverick. Not racing where you're both at low life, so that might be tricky to pay for use Ancient Tomb more than once
It might be, yeah. I
outside the combo.
I think you could experiment with it. I played an Ancient Tomb, and I
Yeah.
found it worked fine, although it wasn't quite as good.
Mm.
Sometimes the Cradle is bad from hand. I often find myself bottoming the Cradle, depending on the hand.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, maybe you can like Hex Drinker and Ancient Tomb. That would be sweet.
Yes, yeah. Ooze does have upside with Scythecap Cub. That's a good point. A Scythecap Cub is just it's just like White Plume Adventure before it came online. Nobody really knows what it's capable of. Just yet sitting there in like Navyville, USA. Of course, according to Carador, it was released 2 days ago. There you go. All right, budget options. Tech. Okay, so we addressed this earlier. We had a slide about tech cards that when we wanted to splash. Yeah, I personally prefer the red splash. Yeah. All right. In the interest of time, let's. Why is this not working? There we go.
Oh, and then I would say if anyone has any questions, feel free to PM me on the Discord or Gary. We're pretty easy to reach, or just shout us out in the Maverick Discord, or just PM me at Clips4Lyfe. I'm happy to help or point in any directions, or just if I don't get to you, I'd be pretty busy with life these days. Just tag me in a post in the general Maverick channel or whatever.
Yeah. I would say I've most frequently missed the red splash, probably because it hits Murktide Regent. It hits but counters it's good versus control. It's good against Echo of Eons. You can randomly cast it to put an instant in your graveyard for the raccoon. I personally miss isn't quite the right word. It's yeah, I was actually working on an experiment a couple of months ago where I had the very lightest possible red splash where it was really only for blast, and at one point it was for punishing fire and blast, and then it was for just for blast. And I arrived back at green white, unfortunately. I think you need going back to the other slide. This is where I'm at right now. Whoops. I think if you're going to splash, it's a critical sideboard card or to execute the game plan better or both. And one of the questions I'm asking myself right now is, what about a Johnny plus broadside? Is that better executing the game plan? It's TBD. Not really sure yet. All right, let's take a look at the list.
While you're pulling that up, I'll say that the more I play green white, I think I had a very long list to start with, but the longer I played it, the smaller that list gets. I think you brought up a really good example like Red Blast. I find my fair blue matchup to be favorable now. So I don't think Red Blast, the opportunity cost of Red Blast makes those matchups marginally better from already good for me, and then takes away the opportunity cost to play other combo hates in the sideboard, like more graveyard hates or Force of Vigors for Stompy or something like that. But probably the most missed one would probably be Thoughtseize, because I mostly play on MTGO and it's just like random combo decks all the time. So Thoughtseize is a missed effect in green white for sure.
Okay, so let's talk through the list here. Most of it has been talked through. Let me just start with this one. Once Upon a Time. I don't know who figured this out, but 3 is the number you want. You just want 3, mainly because you see it in your opening hand and you're happy, but then you're probably not going to see it till much later in the game again, when you probably have the mana to cast it. And I have, as this is showed to me by Achilles, you can actually trim one sideboarding sometime. We talked about Remnant Excavator. Okay, this is really interesting. So we have talked ourselves into Teague is the killer bear that you want in the main, and the other two bears, Oof and Liberator, should go in the sideboard. And the reason is that most of the time you don't want the key Teague because it turns off the Green Sun's Zenith, but he can also act like Thalia number 5 from hand. So here we are back to from hand. The reason he's here is mostly so you can play him from hand or bail yourself out, and he shuts down stuff most of the time. One of the downsides to playing this equipment is that Collector Oof turns it off. Collector Oof is not in the main here.
Oh, as I say, Teague also turns off. I would just say that the floor of turning off Force of Will is probably the highest out of Teague versus Oof, and so the majority of format plays Force of Will. And like we've talked about, there's some awkward situations you can get your Delver opponent into, and the name of the game with Maverick is making your opponent feel as awkward as possible, both across the table and in gameplay. But
we lost mainboard Birds of Paradise. So we lost Chris here. I am going to ping him real quickly. Okay, I will continue narrating while Chris hops back on. Birds of Paradise. Yeah, I think here the reason that we like it here is that the Birds of Paradise has evasion and can carry these swords and taps for white and green. There have been various times where I've chosen to play actually no Birds of Paradise and a ignoble hierarch because I like Exalted and because it's better for Thalia to attack through that way, but there's some reason to believe that is good here. Script Ranger, lots of cool tricks. So you can Script Ranger is most maximized when you can have Mother of Runes because then you can double protect. But also Script Ranger can double activate Neither Reliquary or even triple activate it when you consider the opponent's turn.
yeah, and I think just having like flyers is really important with these equipment when the board is gummed up. So Scrib Ranger and Birds of Paradise being the two flyers, you can equip a Sword of Fire and Ice or a GT2 and like actually start to peck through a complex board state is pretty huge. And Birds lets you do that with Exalted.
That's right. You want to talk about Questing Beast here? So we talked about not playing 3 cost things, but here we are saying here's a 4 cost thing. What do we think about that here? What is going on here?
Yeah, I think it's a flex slot. I don't like Questing Beast in theory, but he keeps overperforming for me randomly. I do think it fits the tempo game plan. I would say if it wasn't for Tameo being the meta, I would probably not play it. So I think just being able to respect Tameo game 1, even versus tempo decks, is pretty important.
Yeah. So you can see here the 2 Stoneforge Mystic. In this version, we have 3 Mother of Runes. The most interesting thing here that I'd like to bring up is I don't want to discuss the sideboard in great detail because this just rotates all the time, and like we could be having a different conversation in a month. But I'm starting to come around on I'm not sure who it was that had this idea, but that maybe Outland Liberator and Collector Oof should maybe we should leave these bullets here in the board so
Oh
we can
yeah,
maximize our
that's
game
all
plan all the
Lorcac.
time.
That's all Lorcac. I
All,
stole that from him.
okay.
He's always 3 steps ahead of everybody.
Yeah, he's 3 steps ahead once again here. So
He's a goat.
I'm just going to show you one other list that I was working on. It's very similar. I think it's this one. Yeah, so this one here is very similar. It just trades the 3rd Savannah for a Talon Gates and plays 2 Endurance Main and only 2 Mother of Runes and no Questing Beast. It's really just around the edges here. This is before I considered putting the Liberator here in the board. Yeah, I almost don't have a whole lot more to say about the construction of green-white here. The one other difference you saw in mine here was that I have, I think, like an Arid Mesa or something that taps for white. I'm sorry, another one that searches up a basic plains here. But
Can I? How about Talon Gates? I'm curious.
How do I feel about Talon Gates?
I have some opinions, but I want to hear what you think.
Yeah. So Talon Gates ha- Talon Gates is almost like more at home in a non green white list and one with a splash because the filtering turns out to be useful because the mana is tough at times.
Yep.
It gives the Knight of the Reliquary the ability to protect itself and to protect one of your threats. It is really awesome from hand to use as a removal spell, and it comes up surprisingly often that you activate it for 4. So just the total flexibility of it, the ability for it to fix mana, and that it comes in untapped, I think warrants its inclusion most of the time. Also,
Hmm.
if you phase out your thing that has an equipment on it, the equipment too is phased out, so sometimes you can save that. I think it just has enough critical mass of tricks to be worth it. That is not a deep conviction, but that's just kind of how I feel about it. I've been really liking it. It's probably better with Elvish Reclaimer.
Yeah.
Yeah, the splash is
And
also dropping in.
white.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think
Yeah.
about it?
Yeah, I've been testing it because I know a lot of people are high on it, and it's very obviously insane with White of the Reliquary, right? Because you never have to tap it, and then you always get value. The more I play with it, the less impressed I am.
Hmm.
I was on 14, and I went down to 13 because the Carador's upon a time map, which kind of says you can justify it because I think you're like an 85% chance or 87 versus like an 89 or 90%. So I've been trying to play around with that slot a little bit more. I was like a pretty firm believer in 14 green sources before, but I think the best ability has been to stop a blocker, but I found that the protection has been awkward because I'm usually tapping my knights either to find Wasteland or Cradle or Rising Canopy, and or just like attacking, right? It's, oh, they have 12 life and I have 6 knight. I am gonna try and kill them in 2 turns and try to play that tempo dance and kill them before I can tap versus just like sitting there with no pressure and keeping a knight untapped so I can protect it. So it's been like weird. And then I've also ran into some times where you try to protect something with it, let's say against combo, and you're like, okay, you protect the THALIA against Abrupt Decay or Storm. The issue I found is then it's phased out, and
And
then
it's
they go
gone.
to their turn and they kill you, right? It's
Yeah.
not like a jury step, right, where it's like still there. Do you think it's like it's cool to stop blockers or like a lethal attacker and like surprise combat damage or combat math? But I found it not to happen as often as I thought it would, and it's been like a it's not it has a low or I say like decent floor, like you said, because the mana fixing like kind of surprisingly comes up a lot. But it's like I don't know how I feel about it. I don't know what else to play though at the same time. I don't know if anyone has any cool ideas like Blast Zone. I don't know if we can really use that. Or there was that one that Chris from MTG's 90 was using from like the the whatever that apocalyptic set is. I forgot based on the video game.
Right.
Yeah, Fallout. Thank you.
Yeah.
The one that's like a fake blast zone, but you can do it for 0, but it only has one thing. I don't know about that either, but I'm waiting for a utility land I can play. I think Bog probably is like a safe option, but getting Bog on a turn 3 night is really slow against the decks you want to do it. So it's like it's meh. So yeah, I don't know. I'll let you know if I think of anything, but for now, I think
Kingpin
Talon will
S.
stay, and I'm gonna
Kingpin
play
S.
with.
Is Caracas worth it here? I haven't. I have never really. This is very like kind of Newton-esque like conversation, which is really good. Newton has done some really cool work on the Cradle lists. I don't know. To me, it seems useful enough. Obviously, we're all big on Thalia. You can sometimes win a game by just playing a turn to Thalia and then an untapped Caracas. Caracas also has tricks with your own guys, bouncing a Teague back to protect that against control or something. Tameo is very popular, and Caracas is very good against Tameo. With Merit Lage on the decline, I would admit its biggest use case is not as common, but it is an untapped white source. Worst case scenario. I don't know. I guess I never really considered getting rid of it.
I thought about it a couple months ago when I was trying to maximize green sources, and I think I was trying to find a slot for a 15th green source, and played around with the idea of dropping Caracas because I do think you're on something. Kingpin, I think it's at its worst space in Magic history, but I do think it's still pretty important for the tempo-oriented strategy because, like Gary, you said, you get to protect Thalia. That's pretty huge, and like really gives some players some fits when they like have to spend 2 removal spells on Thalia, then you have a backup one so they can hand they know about. There's also some like small tricks where like with Gaddock Teague where you can like end of their turn, like pick it up, and then you can use your Zenith and then like replay Gaddock Teague on your turn to let you use that. And like you wouldn't be able to do that if you had no Caracas, you'd have to plow your own dig or something, which would be a really hard play to win the game off of. But I think that, yeah, and then you can also, like, again, we're trying to tempo, so you can like tempo out a Nadu player. It's hard, but like I've had games where it's, yeah, they keep having to replay that Nadu at three mana, and I keep wasting their other sources, so they can't really make any get ahead on board, and they're just drawing cards with nothing to do with it because they have to keep playing this Nadu, and then you like kill them with a knight. I find that bouncing Tameo for me just like never works out. Like usually I bounce it once, and then the next turn they play it, and they always have Brainstorm, and it flips. So I think it just is what it is. Maybe it's my luck, but it's been like mid for me against Tameo, and then there's other scenarios where it's like you can bounce the tracks on a key turn to like swing for lethal, and they don't have the lifelink blocker and whatnot.
I think the tricky thing with it mostly comes down to if you did cut it, what you'd probably put in its place would probably would have to also be untapped, also produce at least white. Maybe it's worth it for consistent. It's not obvious like what would go in its place. Is guess what I'm trying to say. Maybe you could talk yourself into like a Talon Gates. It's not a perfect comparison. It's just that it being an untapped white source is pretty darn awesome. That's a really
Yeah,
interesting
I
idea.
think
I'm sure
like if
somebody should experiment with it. I don't yet want to do that, but I might.
I
It's probably the
yeah,
most interesting
I put it
question
in
we've
the
gotten
sideboard
yet.
for a little. Yeah, I put in the sideboard for a little bit before the last one ended, like Psychic Frog, and I don't think that it was worth it. I think if you closed your eyes and I told you there is a land that taps in your colors that like bounces all these creatures and protects your own spells and can even stop some combo decks, you'd probably want to sign up for that right away. And I think that's like where Caracas stands
Yeah.
for me. So I don't think there's anything like even close to it as far as utility lands in power other than Wasteland and Kaya's Cradle. I think Caracas is on par with the Surveil land, maybe better than the Surveil lands, and I would say it's better than Horizon Canopy. So I think it's still pretty good, even if it's less good, like THALIA and the Reliquary and all the other cards we're talking about today.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're getting close to the end here because I got to get up tomorrow morning fairly early. But I wanted to talk about this. This is my most recent. A lot has been talked about Curator and why it's generally worth it over Ooze. Although Strat Daddy's done a great job with both. I would say. Okay. Last point on the core list here. I would say the two flexiest of the flex spots would probably be these four cards. I would say that these are the most up for debate. That third Savannah, I have as a Talon Gates. Do you want another Mother Runes? It's a fair question. Script Ranger, I think, is worth it, but some people don't play it. And Questing Beast was like explicitly. I would argue even these are not that flexy, but
yeah, I was gonna say Scrib is pretty important in this build, even if Scrib's days are she's not as good as before. But I think for this green white build with just the equipment alone, having the 1/1 flyer is pretty strong.
yeah, that's a good point. The last thing I want to talk about here is I have actually come around to this year, Prismatic Ending. I really think this is a really good tempo card right now.
Yeah.
I've come to this conclusion. I was thinking about it wrong. Oh, okay, we can't make 4 mana or whatever. But this just cleans up anything, mostly the small. It allows you to actually bolt the bird versus Nadu or something like that.
Yep.
And unlike, say, a Pithing Needle that just sits around, and then if you really need to late in the game, you can use a Birds of Paradise or a Talon Gates or something to get to 3 or 4 different colors. I am really excited about this card right now, and I really like it. I've been playing it in the sideboard. I've also played it as a one of in the main board at various times. But it's because it's going to get rid of stuff that costs 1 or 2. Mostly 1.
Yeah. I've wanted to play in the main board, honestly, lately, too. I just don't have... I think it's really... You dismember before, and just 1 mana... We're playing tempo again, so the difference between 1 and 2 mana spells are a reactive spell, because when you're trying to play proactive threats, the deck is huge. That could be a turn, and like we're trying to minimize when possible to kill our opponents or offset them enough to like really create a turn of the night double waste and put them out of the game. That's and Path Exile ramping opponent in a Wasteland deck is pretty detrimental for us. Prismatic Ending also has the benefit, going back to that question of what do I miss when I don't splash. Abrupt Decay cards when it came down to flip Tamios, and I realized that they might have a double force hand to protect it, and I'll live with that. They at that point, Prismatic Ending able to enter a Tamiyo is why I moved on from Dismember.
Yeah, I think when you that plus random cleaning up of stuff, plus getting rid of a
Chalices,
pile,
right?
getting rid of, but really
Yeah,
it's like Nadu because I've been playing Lightning Bolt in
yeah,
the red version, and you can beat the Nadu if you have a critical mass of removal spells and then something to clean up, a nice finisher to follow up the game.
yeah.
Although the
That's how
Nadu
you beat
matchup is not
Nadu.
favorable.
Is
Do not get me wrong about that one.
yeah, it's hard. I feel pretty decent if I win the coin flip with this version, just because of the 6/1 mana removal spells on their mana door. Like you basically, your game plan is to attack their mana very aggressively, hit their mana dorks, waste them, and then make it so that when their Nadu comes down, they can't combo off that turn and you kill them, or Cheat does a lot of work. So
You can bounce with
I
Caracas.
find that yeah, exactly, right? So you're tempering them, right? You can't outvalue Nadu. If you play against Nadu, you can't outvalue at least the Bant versions. It's very difficult. They're very redundant with tutors, they got fairies and stuff like that. So trying to play a long grindy game versus them is feels like fool's errand to me. It hasn't gone well for me in my experience. Even if I play Jeskai, it can be challenging. It's just trying to get under them. I think someone had brought up, I don't remember who it was, like run afoul or like other ways to kill Nadu on the stack. I think those ones don't work either because they just combo and respond. So just attacking the mana base very aggressively with wastelands and spot removal on the mana dorks actually makes your Thalia pretty decent too. And then you find ways to get ahead of them and make them use their Force of Wills proactively or reactively instead of using it to protect their combo, and you can actually get them into a tight spot. So
Yeah. I was playing Pithing Needle in this spot, and I now have come to the conclusion that was a mistake.
oh really? I'm testing that right now.
No,
Don't tell me
yeah,
that.
no, I think it was because Lightning Bolt's just been awesome for the red version. But yeah, all right, we've gone super
Yeah.
long here. I just want to say one last thing. Just two people with some opinions. There's a lot of people with others. This is hard.
Yep.
It's, but it's also fun because it's hard, and your opponents will be like, how on earth are people winning with this pile of nonsense? These cards that are so old. I think Duke's got like a 4/1 playing like a punishing list from with every card was this 11.
That was such a sick league. Yeah.
So you just never know the way it's all going to go. And yeah, there's a lot of cool ways. Green white is probably the hardest to master outside of the Lorcac version, as we've talked a lot about, because you just have to breed and game plan correctly, because there isn't a Jund card to value yourself out of the game or back into the game.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
a synergy tempo focused strategy rather than a Jund and slam value threats type of strategy. So it just plays out differently, but it's very fun and rewarding. So I what you said too. I think there's shout outs just to the Maverick Discord. It's probably my favorite Discord to be a part of, but everyone's just so cool and always bouncing ideas off each other and very excited to play a deck that a lot of people have called dead. Great place to be if you're not already there, and hit Gary and I up.
Yeah, hit us up. I'm sure Dukes will be out there streaming. Strass will be streaming. I
Yep.
very occasionally hop on. I got a couple of fun ideas I'm looking forward to testing in the next coming weeks. But anyway, thanks you all for joining in. This has been very long, and I will get the VOD up, and hopefully it'll be a cool resource going forward. And in that VOD link, I will probably include those articles and other YouTubes that Clips and Carador and some other people help me find. So thanks so much for joining in, and feel free to ask more questions, because this is silly and fun and all that good stuff. Thank you very much, Chris, and we'll see you all soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Bye.